Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Monroe County, Michigan, a rural Halloween party. Hundreds of costumes under floodlights and bonfires. Among them is 22-year-old Chelsea Bruck, dressed in a handmade poison ivy outfit. Before sunrise, she disappears. No apartment corridor, no bedroom scene, only fields, cars, and county roads. This case starts not with a 911 emergency call, but with a missing person report that sets an entire community in motion. The gathering took place on the night of October 25th into the early morning of October 26, 2014 in Frenchtown Township. Chelsea was last verifiably seen after 1 a.m. drifting between groups of friends near parked vehicles and the edge of the party. Her phone and personal items had been left with a friend earlier in the evening, so when attempts to reach her failed, there was no digital trail. By October 27th, her absence was no longer a rumor, it was official. From the first hours, detectives recognized the challenge. With no enclosed room to seal off, the search area was the outdoors itself. Grass fields, ditches, and gravel shoulders where hundreds had gathered. Investigators fixed a timeline of her last known movements, identified attendees who had direct contact in that window, and began pulling in party photos and crowd videos for timestamps and background captures. These fragments, metadata more than images, were the only digital anchors available. The witness pool was massive. Officers had to separate statements into tiers: direct interaction, indirect visual sightings, and speculative claims. Rumors suggested she went inside a structure for warmth, but no corroboration existed. No photo, no property owner, no second witness. The consistent record held. Chelsea was last seen outside in costume sometime after 1 a.m. The community response was immediate. Flyers went up, volunteers lined fields, police briefings warned against speculation. For family, the appeal was simple: keep searching. For investigators, the absence of a defined scene demanded a broader approach, expanding ground coverage while tightening the timeline around those final minutes she was visible. Chelsea Bruck's disappearance entered the record as an outdoor case with no initial digital trail and no evidence of an indoor crime scene. The first step was set: find where the county itself might hold the answer. If faced with a case that offers no clear indoor crime scene, would you put more weight on widening physical search grids or on tightening the witness list? Morning light did not narrow anything. The party field was quiet, the gravel shoulder still scarred by tire ruts, and the only certainty was absence. With no room to seal and no corridor to tape off, detectives converted open ground into workload. Fix the last credible sightings, build a radius, and start ruling out claims that could not be proved. In cases like this, the first real discovery is often negative, proving where the victim did not go. That isn't a story beat, it's casework. The witness net was wide. Officers prioritized people who interacted with Chelsea after 1 a.m., separating direct contact from distant glimpses and late-arriving rumors. Notes were taken in controlled settings to prevent cross-pollination. Details that lined up independently: position of a pickup near the edge of the crowd, the time the music dropped for a generator refuel, the moment a friend remembered seeing the green costume silhouette moving toward parked cars, were logged as anchors. Claims that she stepped inside a structure for warmth had no corroboration, no homeowner, no second witness, no image placing her at a threshold. The working model stayed outside. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, an investigator said later, meaning they kept pressure on the assumptions and demanded proof for anything that contradicted the outdoor picture. Search operations scaled fast. Deputies and volunteers established line searches along drainage ditches and fence lines radiating from the party acreage. Permissions were secured for private parcels on likely footpaths if a ride fell through. Team leads briefed volunteers to report, not disturb, anything that could be evidentiary: fabric scraps, a shoe without its pair, drag marks that survived overnight traffic. The aim wasn't to find a narrative object. It was to locate anything that could be authenticated, packaged, and tested, or to preserve the ground long enough for a forensic team to see it undisturbed. In towns like this, violent crime doesn't just harm one person, it strains the quiet that people rely on. The response here was disciplined, not theatrical. With Chelsea's phone left behind the night before, digital forensics shifted from device pings to environmental signals. Investigators requested public assistance for crowd photos and short clips taken near the time window, not for entertainment value but for metadata and background. A parked car's position at 1:07 a.m. matters if, at 1:20 it's gone and no one places the victim near it. A flashlight beam in a clip can reveal ground conditions at the shoulder. These fragments did not solve the case, but they turned guesswork into geometry. Every confirmed minute tightened the map. Every disproved rumor shrank the noise. Rumor control was not cosmetic. It protected the timeline. When a story circulated that a stranger offered a ride, officers looked for the full chain. Who heard it? Who can place a vehicle matching the description? And whether anyone remembers the individual before or after the alleged contact. Without those elements, it remained noise. A second rumor suggested an argument near the music gear. Again, no independent witness and no corroborating media. Those leads were logged, time-stamped, and set aside pending new information. The point was not to disbelieve people. It was to prevent narrative drift from burying the facts that would matter later. Searchers moved in measured grids, marking cleared areas with colored flags and GPS logs so they could return to gaps exposed by new witness detail. Any item found would be photographed in place, described for context, then preserved. The instruction was simple. Do not create evidence by moving it into a better picture. Chain of custody starts at the ground. Supervisors tracked weather shifts that could degrade trace material and prioritized vulnerable zones along culverts and low brush where runoff might deposit small objects. Nothing dramatic happened in these first passes, and that was expected. Building a case often means building a clean absence around the moment where something finally appears. Family coordination stayed tight. Public messaging asked for specific information, time, place, contact, and avoided speculation about suspects or motives. That restraint signaled to the community that the investigation would be built on what could be proven. People kept showing up to help. Flyers went out to gas stations and workplaces. Farmers allowed access along property edges that met the line search corridors, even when it slowed their day. The county was not waiting on a twist. It was doing work. By the end of this phase, the record was clear on several points that would not change. Chelsea's last credible movements were outdoors at a large rural party in Frenchtown Township after 1 a.m. No identified indoor primary crime scene existed then or later. The investigation's first forensic value here was the elimination of false paths and the creation of a precise search geometry, a disciplined framework designed to capture the first material item without contaminating it. When a county becomes the scene, the first victory is control. The next step is contact. Late March brought the first tangible break. On March 22, 2015, a resident walking a familiar roadside noticed a single woman's shoe resting near a shallow ditch. Deputies photographed it in place, shot scale images, logged GPS, and flagged the shoulder so traffic wouldn't crush trace. The shoe was bagged in clean paper, sealed, and barcoded. Within hours, the family viewed it under controlled conditions and recognized it as Chelsea's. That confirmation did two things at once. It locked the search corridor into a real direction of travel, and it forced investigators to treat the surrounding ground as potential evidence, not just terrain. Area canvas followed. A second pass cleared 30 to 50 yards on both sides of the find, taking care not to flood the ditch with boots. The team documented wheel marks, discarded cups, and anything that could be dated to the party night versus later litter. Soil scrapings close to the shoe were collected for comparison in case future items turned up with similar mineral signatures or vegetation. The field report noted no patterns that established a struggle. That's important. No one tried to read a story out of ground that wasn't speaking. What the shoe gave investigators was a reliable pin on the map and a reason to move the radius north and west along footpaths and rural shoulders people actually use when they don't have a ride. Chain of custody stayed tight. The property tag showed the exact mileage from the party site, the road name, collection time down to the minute, and initials for each handoff from scene to property to the lab. Inside the lab, procedures were routine and careful. Visual documentation, microscopy for fibers or plant matter, and swabs from the interior for possible contact DNA. Footwear often yields less than people expect. Sweat and environmental exposure degrade biological material. But even a non-result tells you something. If the lab can't recover usable DNA from the insole, you stop waiting for the shoe to carry the whole case and you keep working the ground. In the days that followed, search supervisors rebalanced resources. Volunteers were reassigned from broad, low-yield fields to narrower corridors that connected the party property to paved access points, and beyond those, to rail-adjacent easements. The logic was simple. If a person on foot was moving without a phone, she would follow the easiest visible line, shoulder, path, or trackside. Deputies revisited witness notes with the shoe's position in mind, looking for any sighting that became more plausible given the new anchor. A pickup a witness swore was parked near the road at a specific time now mattered less than whether anyone saw Chelsea moving toward that road at all. The case remained outdoors. Nothing in the file suggested an interior scene. Roughly a week after the shoe surfaced, an unrelated citizen report led officers to a vacant structure near railroad tracks in Flat Rock, just over the county line in Wayne County. It was the kind of empty industrial shell that collects windblown debris. Inside, near an open area, officers located two items consistent with what the missing person bulletin had described: a green leotard and an auburn red wig. No one declared the site a crime scene. It was an evidence recovery location, and it was treated as such, photographed before contact, gridded for small fines, and cordoned so that the first footprints on the dust were the team's. What investigators could see without guessing was straightforward. The leotard's fabric showed damage at stress points. That observation is not a conclusion about cause. It is a description that matters because later testing can distinguish between clean garment failure and force-related tearing. The wig was bagged separately to prevent fiber transfer between items. Technicians documented the site's interior, entry points, light conditions, and obvious recent disturbances, but did not push for a narrative the space could not support. This was not a bedroom or a personal residence. Nothing about the layout suggested the assault had happened there. It read like disposal. The lab work on the leotard mattered more than the building. Swabs were taken from high-contact sections. Areas of discoloration underwent presumptive tests and then confirmatory testing as appropriate. The goal was to generate profiles, first to confirm association with Chelsea, then to identify any unknown contributors. Touch DNA is not magic. It favors careful sampling and patience. When a lab does recover a profile, it is because the garment was preserved correctly and processed methodically, not because the story needed it. Investigators didn't wait on results to plan. The 2-week window surrounding the garment drop was scrutinized. Who had reason to be in that structure? Who mentioned rail lines in interviews or lived close enough for the location to make sense? Officers checked calls for service around the property, trespass complaints, and routine patrol logs that might place a vehicle there. Nothing connected cleanly yet, and that was fine. The team had learned to keep pressure on the data, not on a preferred shape. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, one detective later remarked. He meant that even when a path seemed obvious, they revalidated each step. Because the leotard and wig were found across a county line, interagency coordination kicked in. Evidence remained under the originating agency's case number to keep paperwork coherent, but Flat Rock officers assisted with site security and local canvass. Jurisdictional seams can fracture cases if people guard turf. Here they didn't. The focus stayed on evidence integrity and on tracing how those items moved from a party field in Frenchtown Township to an empty building by tracks in Flat Rock. The public never saw the lab bench, but they felt the investigation change. A shoe and 2 high-value clothing items are not leads, they are anchors. They allow detectives to build probability rather than hope. They explain why certain fields stop getting walked and why rail easements start getting more attention. They justify a new wave of interviews with targeted questions. Did you ever go near the tracks that night? Did you ride past Flat Rock? Do you know anyone who uses that building to hang out? Those questions were asked without accusation. They existed to pressure test the new map. By now, months had passed since the party. That timeline can feel heavy from the outside, but in homicide work, it is common. Outdoor recoveries rarely give up everything at once. The human dimension matters too. Families run on endurance. Communities get tired but keep showing up. The value for viewers is practical. The reason investigators ask for seemingly tiny details, a turn taken to avoid a pothole, a pickup left idling for 10 minutes, has nothing to do with drama. It is how radius, timing, and route get turned into something you can enter in a report, defend in court, and use to find the next piece. The next piece would come soon, and it would close one chapter while opening another. Before that, the lab's early returns on the leotard confirmed what the field suspected. The garment was directly associated with the victim, and it carried additional biological material suitable for profiling. The site still did not transform into a scene. It stayed what it was, a place where items were left. But the fabric started talking, and once it did, the case moved from map-making to identification. There is one more point to record. None of these finds altered the standing facts. Chelsea had been last seen outdoors at a large party after 1 a.m. No indoor primary crime scene had been identified then or later, and each new item fit an outdoor chain that moved from a rural field to a roadside ditch to a vacant structure by tracks. When a case is coherent, new evidence doesn't rewrite the past, it confirms it. April 24, 2015, Ash Township, Monroe County. Contractors clearing a wooded strip off Briar Hill Road stopped work and called it in. Patrol held the perimeter until detectives and the medical examiner arrived. The approach was standard and strict: wide shots, mid-range, close-ups with scale, flag paths to keep boots off fragile ground, log GPS and bearing for every photographed feature. This was not a room to seal. It was an outdoor recovery in leaf litter and roots, near the rail line that had framed earlier searches. Skeletal remains were documented in situ, then carefully collected under the medical examiner's direction. Nearby debris was photographed and bagged separately to avoid cross-transfer. Soil cores came from any discolored or compacted patches. Branch placement and cover materials were recorded, not to build a story, but to preserve context if a court later asked how the body came to rest there. Identification proceeded by comparison. Dental records matched, and the missing person file for Chelsea Brooke became a homicide file. The autopsy read like a clean report, not a script. Craniofacial fractures consistent with blunt force trauma established cause and manner of death. Decomposition and animal activity limited fine timing. The examiner did not overstate what the remains could no longer say. What survived on bone mattered more than what didn't. The pattern was not a simple fall. It was force. Detectives treated the wood line exactly as the facts allowed. A recovery location, not a primary scene. No claim of an indoor struggle surfaced because none existed in the record. That distinction kept the case coherent with what came before. The party field, the roadside shoe, the leotard and wig in a vacant structure by the tracks. The geography held. The map was tightening, not changing. With identification and cause of death locked, interviews were reopened with precision. Prior statements were tested against the fracture profile. Rumors that never had timestamps or independent witnesses remained sidelined. Route reconstruction became priority work. Party acreage to ditch line, ditch to flat rock structure, structure to Briar Hill Woods. Interagency coordination smoothed the edges. Monroe County and Flat Rock shared notes on transfer possibilities, patrol logs, trespass calls, anything that could stitch the chain without inventing links. Families deserve clarity, not spectacle. This phase delivered it. The victim was confirmed. The death was violent. The case remained outdoors. And the next move was obvious. Finish the full lab documentation of the remains and press the garment evidence already in custody, the leotard with biological material that could talk in a way the ground could not. The Flat Rock recovery site had already shifted the investigation, but the real weight came when the green leotard moved from storage into the forensic biology lab. From the outside, it looked ordinary, but for the analysts, it was a controlled surface. Every movement was documented. Gloves changed between swabs, sterile packaging opened only once, chain of custody signed and sealed. The public often imagines that evidence speaks instantly. In reality, weeks of testing and verification pass before a single conclusion can be entered into a file. Technicians began with standard light inspections, searching for visible stains and fiber disturbances. They noted tearing at seams and fabric stress consistent with handling under force, but the conclusion was left open until laboratory comparison could define it further. Presumptive tests for biological fluids produced positive reactions at multiple contact points. Swabs were collected from the interior lining, chest seams, and leg edges, locations most likely to capture skin contact. Each sample was split to allow retesting if defense counsel later challenged the findings. The results were conclusive. Chelsea's profile appeared where expected. verifying the garment's direct association with her. More important was the presence of a second contributor. This wasn't a faint trace. The alleles crossed threshold at multiple loci and repeated across extractions. Analysts confirmed a male profile, suitable for entry into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. For the first time, the investigation had a biological link not just to the victim, but to someone else who had left their genetic signature on her clothing. Investigators understood what this meant. Geography had guided them so far. The party field, the ditch, the abandoned structure, the woods. Now biology would narrow the suspect pool to one. But before rushing forward, they waited for the database process to complete. CODIS requires profiles to meet strict standards of quality and documentation. If an analyst overstates confidence, a judge can suppress the entire result. The Monroe County team wasn't going to risk that. By mid-2016, the call came back. The male profile from the leotard hit in CODIS. The name attached was not a stranger to the criminal system. It came from a prior felony arrest where a DNA sample had been lawfully collected. The match wasn't the end of the case. It was the beginning of a new phase. A hit must be confirmed by independent comparison in the lab. Analysts reran the profile with fresh controls. Once the confirmation stood, they reported out to detectives with the confidence required to take the next investigative step. Detectives now had a suspect name, but they held it tightly. The strategy wasn't to confront with evidence right away. Instead, they built an interview plan designed to capture a voluntary narrative. If the suspect admitted attending the Halloween party, what details would he recall? Would his timeline intersect with Chelsea's? If he claimed no contact, how would he explain his DNA on her clothing? These questions would be tested in a controlled room, not in public. Meanwhile, the lab continued examining secondary traces. Soil embedded in fabric was compared against samples from Briar Hill Road and the flat rock structure. Trace fibers were cataloged in case they later matched vehicle interiors or carpets. None of these secondary results were dramatic, but they fortified the chain of evidence. In a trial setting, strength comes from the accumulation of small, reproducible facts, not from one flashy headline. For Chelsea's family, the CODIS hit was never broadcast in detail. They were told progress was being made, but investigators avoided overpromising. Public confidence had to be balanced with case integrity. Communities were eager for resolution, but if the case collapsed under weak handling, justice would be delayed again. Holding back details protected both the investigation and the eventual prosecution. What makes this chapter important is not the revelation of a name that belongs to the courtroom. It's the proof that methodical, by-the-book science can cut through rumor and speculation. A garment recovered from a forgotten building spoke louder than months of conflicting witness statements. It gave detectives leverage, direction, and something that would withstand cross-examination when the time came. By July 2016, the file had what it needed to move. A CODIS-confirmed male profile from the leotard, a coherent outdoor chain of recoveries, and a medical examiner's conclusion of blunt force head trauma with facial fractures. Detectives scheduled a controlled recorded interview with the man tied to that DNA, a meeting planned in steps, not surprises. The objective was simple: document his story before disclosing specifics, then measure every claim against what the evidence already fixed. He began with distance. He didn't know the victim, he said. He hadn't been at that party. No contact. Detectives let the denial stand and worked time. They asked about late October 2014 movements, about routes he used in Monroe County, about reasons he might be near rural fields or the tracks that cut through flat rock. When someone says never, investigators look for the first except. It came quickly. Yes, he knew of the party. He'd been nearby that night. He might have seen people in costume. He couldn't say who. The room stayed neutral. No accusations, no raised voice, just a pace that keeps the subject talking. As the clock moved, he conceded more. He admitted meeting a woman dressed in green. He admitted sexual contact. Then he reframed the event as consensual, rough activity that went wrong. He said she went limp, and he panicked. He added that he left her outdoors and didn't tell anyone. The admission shifted the case from "do you know the victim" to "explain this chain of decisions," and it did it without the detectives ever revealing the lab report. This is where interviews stop being about words and become about pressure points. The medical examiner's file was clear. The victim died from blunt force trauma with multiple facial fractures. That profile is not a soft tissue uncertainty, it is physical damage to bone. The man's account did not address that. He didn't describe a fall from height, an impact with a heavy object, or any mechanism that could produce those fractures. His version was inconsistent with the body. In a proper interview, you don't feed a subject the inconsistency, you let the record do it. Detectives asked him to describe on his own every action after the contact, where he went, how he moved the body, what he did with clothing. He spoke in fragments. He could not maintain a stable route. On placement, he wavered. On timelines, he contradicted himself within minutes. He tried to minimize disposal. He said he left her in the woods, a phrase that obscures more than it explains. Detectives pressed for landmarks without coaching, roads, fences, structures, rail lines. The more specific the question, the less stable his answer. He did not volunteer the Flat Rock building or the Briar Hill area. He did not account for the garment's presence in that vacant structure. When the team asked about the clothing, he stumbled between "she had it" and "I don't remember," a hedge that collapses when a lab report can place a profile on the fabric and a case log can place the fabric across a county line. The tone stayed professional. The point was not to win the room, it was to preserve admissible statements. The man now acknowledged sexual contact. He acknowledged that the victim became unresponsive. He acknowledged leaving her outdoors without calling for help. Those are three separate admissions with separate legal consequences. Under Michigan law, the homicide statute includes a felony murder rule that can elevate a death occurring during certain felonies to first-degree murder. Detectives weren't making legal conclusions in the interview, but they were creating a record that prosecutors could later align with statute. After the interview, the team did what experienced investigators always do. They attempted to corroborate or break his claims. Vehicle locations were reviewed again. The routes he offered were compared against the known sites and against what people already placed in time. No surveillance tape magically fixed him at a door. That was never the expectation in a rural case. But his story had measurable seams. Where he said he hadn't been, a separate statement placed him close. Where he said he left nothing behind, the lab had results. Where he suggested accident, the ME file had fractures. His narrative collapsed under the weight of things that could be swabbed, photographed, or charted. Interview strategy matters because it protects a case from claims of coercion or contamination. Detectives avoided leading questions. They let silence do work. They circled back to original denials and asked why an initial no contact had become an accident. They documented how each revision tracked with known facts. They didn't need to say DNA to make the record clean. They needed the subject to speak uncoached. He did. And when an account changes that dramatically inside a single sitting, jurors later understand what happened long before counsel says it out loud. The community never saw the transcript, but they felt the investigation tighten. Families hope for straight answers. Investigators hope for statements that can be tested against science. Here, the science came first and the words followed. That order is the only one that holds up when everyone in a courtroom is counting minutes and measuring distances. The man in that room presented a story that could not explain bone-level injuries or the movement of clothing across jurisdictions. The file, built over months with restraint, was ready for charging decisions. Human value sits under the procedure. When agencies slow down, write precisely, and refuse to dramatize, they respect the people at the center of the case. They also build something that won't collapse in court. That's how you transform a CODIS hit and an interview into a prosecution. Not by narration, not by intuition, by transcripts, exhibits, and a medical cause of death that the defense can't wish away. Courtrooms don't reward drama, they reward discipline. The case entered trial in 2017 with 4 fixed pillars: an outdoor last seen at a rural party, a chain of recoveries that never moved indoors, a medical cause of death, blunt force head trauma with facial fractures, and a CODIS-confirmed male profile from the victim's leotard. What remained was translation, converting fieldwork and lab work into proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Jurors first heard what the map could show without speculation. Investigators walked them through the sequence that never changed: party acreage, roadside shoe, vacant flat rock structure with clothing, wooded recovery off Briar Hill Road. Each location was documented and each supported the next. No one tried to sell a single crime scene. The state presented an outdoor evidence chain that behaved like a route, not a room. Then the science took the stand. The medical examiner's testimony was clean and limited to what bone could support. Multiple facial fractures, consistent with blunt force injury, not a stumble in grass, not an unexplained collapse. Decomposition made timing imprecise, that was acknowledged. But the nature of the injuries, force to the head, was not. Jurors didn't receive adjectives. They received photographs, diagrams, and definitions. If a witness later claimed accident, that claim would have to clear the fractures. The biology followed. Forensic analysts described how the leotard was processed. Sterile handling, selected swab sites, STR development, replication to guard against dropout, and conservative language in reporting. The key was not the jargon, it was the architecture of controls. The profile wasn't a whisper. Loci across replicates supported a dominant male contributor alongside the victim. Eligibility for CODIS was established. The hit's confirmation pathway was explained. By the time the analyst stepped down, the garment had done what the ground could not. It linked a person to the victim's clothing with a process the defense would have to attack, not dismiss. The interview record mattered because it didn't try to do too much. Jurors heard that the defendant began with distance, no party, no contact, then shifted to acknowledging sexual contact with a woman in green and claiming an accident during rough activity. He admitted leaving her outdoors and telling no one. The state didn't embellish. It placed his revisions beside the fixed forensic baseline and let the conflict speak. A story that struggles to account for blunt force facial fractures is not a story that survives scrutiny. Defense theory moved on two tracks: consent and accident. Consent could not excuse a homicide, and accident had to explain fractures. Counsel pressed decomposition to suggest uncertainty. They pointed to the absence of a single indoor scene as if it created room for doubt. They explored chain of custody, hoping a link would rattle. But contamination claims need facts, not possibilities. And the paperwork was in order: seals, handlers, split samples, replicates, and external audits all lined up. Outdoor evidence is vulnerable to weather and time, not to imagination. The record showed how those vulnerabilities were managed, not ignored. Cross-examination of the medical examiner tried to widen the range of plausible explanations. Could animal activity mimic certain fractures? Could post-mortem changes confuse cause? The answers were calm and bound to the osteology. Some changes are expected outdoors, but the fracture pattern, location, character, and consistency fit force, not scavenging. Jurors are comfortable with limits when a witness respects them. The examiner did. As for the interview, defense suggested panic and poor decisions rather than murderous intent. Jurors heard the timeline inside the room: total denial, then partial presence, then contact, then accident, then disposal. No one alleged a coerced confession. The record showed a subject who spoke freely and inconsistently as questions narrowed. In a case built backward from evidence to words, that order matters. The state didn't need a perfect statement, it needed a measurable one. The judge's instructions did the rest. Michigan's felony murder rule allows first-degree murder when a death occurs during the commission of certain felonies. The prosecution argued that the conduct surrounding the assault and the concealment, taken with the injury pattern and the flight from help, met that standard. The timeline, the garment, the bones, and the defendant's words were offered as a single, coherent picture. Jurors measured it, and they agreed. The verdict, guilty of first-degree felony murder and concealment of a body, did not create a second narrative. It confirmed the only one the evidence could support. No indoor room was retroactively invented. No alternate ending appeared. The outdoor chain held, and the law caught up to it. What matters about this outcome for anyone watching from home is not the headline. It's the method. A county-sized scene can still produce certainty if agencies refuse to rush to a theory and instead build a file that can carry its own weight. Families deserve that kind of case. Jurors deserve that kind of case, and in Monroe County, they got it. The verdict opened the door. Sentencing closed it. In mid-2017, the Monroe County Court imposed life without the possibility of parole for first-degree felony murder and an additional term for concealment of a body. There was no ambiguity left to weigh. The jury had already accepted what the file proved: an outdoor last seen, an outdoor chain of recoveries, a medical cause of death, blunt force head trauma with facial fractures, and a CODIS-confirmed male profile from the victim's leotard that led to Daniel Clay, whose statements collapsed under the forensic record. The law matched the evidence, and the sentence reflected it. Impact statements were brief and direct. They did not retell the investigation. They described what absence does. The court acknowledged the scale of the search and the restraint investigators used to keep speculation out of the file. Monroe County moved from rumor to proof, then to judgment. That is what families deserve when a case spans months in the field and years on the docket. Appeals followed and failed. In 2019, the conviction and sentence were affirmed. No procedural error undid the lab work, the recovery protocols, or the interview record. As of September 14, 2025, Daniel Clay remains incarcerated under life without parole, the concealment sentence running beneath a term that does not expire. The public takeaway is practical. A homicide without an indoor scene can still be solved when investigators build a clean timeline, preserve exterior evidence, and let science lead. The shoe at a ditch line mattered because it was documented correctly. The leotard mattered because it was sampled and reported conservatively. The woods off Briar Hill Road mattered because the medical examiner spoke only to what bone could support. Each piece advanced the case without inventing a room that never existed. The human takeaway is equally clear. Communities help when they report what they know and resist filling gaps with stories. Friends help when they preserve clothing, photos, and timelines. Agencies help when they coordinate across jurisdictions without guarding turf. Those habits don't just honor a victim, they make convictions durable. For Chelsea Bruck, the official record now reads the same in every direction. 2014 disappearance after an outdoor Halloween party in Monroe County. 2015 recovery and identification. 2016 DNA hit. 2017 conviction and life sentence. Status unchanged in 2025. One case, one ending, no competing narratives. Looking back on Chelsea Bruck's case, I'm reminded how fragile safety can be and how vital it is to stand together when tragedy strikes. Justice was served, but no sentence can return what was lost. What we can do is learn, be cautious in public spaces, support families of the missing, and never underestimate the power of community in seeking truth. What about you? What lessons do you take from this story? Share your thoughts and let me know where you're watching from. If this video resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring these stories together.